When the smoke cleared over Europe in the spring of 1945, the architects of the Third Reich faced justice at Nuremberg. But behind them, scattered across a shattered continent, were their children. They carried names that had become synonymous with mass murder, names that echoed through the corridors of concentration camps and the ruins of occupied territories. What became of these sons and daughters remains one of the most psychologically complex chapters in the aftermath of history's most destructive conflict. Before we go deeper into how these lives unfolded in the shadow of unspeakable crimes, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The children born into the upper echelons of Nazi power knew a world of privilege that existed in stark contradiction to the machinery of death their fathers commanded. They lived in requisitioned mansions, attended state functions, and played on the porches of mountain retreats while trainloads of victims rolled toward the gas chambers. Gudrun Himmler, born on the 8th of August 1929, was Heinrich Himmler's only child. Her father, the architect of the Holocaust and commander of the SS, doted on her with an affection that stood in grotesque contrast to the industrial-scale murder he orchestrated. He flew her to his Berlin offices from Munich, called her daily when she was at home, wrote weekly letters when apart. He used a pet name for her that spoke of tenderness. Püppi, he called her. Little doll. She accompanied him to official functions, a carefully groomed symbol of Nazi domesticity, even as her father's SS units murdered millions across occupied Europe. The war's end brought a reckoning that extended beyond the courtroom. Gudrun and her mother were apprehended by American forces and moved through a succession of internment camps in Italy, France, and Germany. They were summoned to Nuremberg to provide testimony during the trials that would define accountability for genocide. In November 1946, they were released. Heinrich Himmler had evaded justice by biting into a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth after his capture in May 1945. His daughter never accepted this widely documented account. She insisted throughout her life that he had been assassinated, murdered by his captors. This rejection of established fact would define her existence for the next 7 decades. What followed was not redemption, but defiance. Gudrun Berwitz, as she became after marriage, devoted her post-war life to preserving her father's image. She became an integral figure in Stille Hilfe, Silent Aid, a clandestine organization that provided financial support, legal assistance, and safe passage to arrested, condemned, or fugitive former SS members. The organization operated in the shadows of West Germany's economic miracle, helping war criminals evade prosecution and flee to South America. Gudrun's involvement was not peripheral. She was central to its operations, a living link to the Nazi hierarchy, unrepentant and unbowed. In the 1960s, West Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND, hired her as an employee, a decision that would later provoke scandal when it became public decades after her death. She worked as a seamstress and secretary to support herself, but her true vocation was the rehabilitation of the SS. She died in Munich on the 24th of May 2018 at the age of 88, having never wavered in her defense of a father who bore direct responsibility for the murder of 6 million Jews. Not all children chose this path. Martin Adolf Bormann was born on the 14th of April 1930, the eldest son of Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful private secretary and head of the party chancellery. As a child, he was shielded from the reality of the regime his father served. That insulation shattered after the war when the full scale of Nazi atrocities became undeniable. His father disappeared in the chaos of Berlin's fall and was tried in absentia at Nuremberg, sentenced to death for war crimes. His remains would not be definitively identified until 1972, excavated from a construction site near the Lehrter railway station in Berlin. For the young Bormann, the revelation of his father's crimes triggered a profound psychological crisis that led him in a direction opposite to Gudrun Himmler's path. In 1947, at the age of 17, Martin Bormann Jr. converted to Roman Catholicism. It was a deliberate act of repudiation, a spiritual rejection of everything his father had represented. He trained for the priesthood, a journey that consumed nearly a decade of study and contemplation. On the 28th of July, 1958, he was ordained. 3 years later, he left Germany entirely, traveling to the Belgian Congo to work as a missionary in some of the most remote and dangerous regions of Africa. He served there until 1964, living in conditions that were the antithesis of his privileged childhood. He later worked in Cameroon, dedicating himself to a life of service that he saw as atonement for his father's sins. But redemption proved more complicated than geography and faith could resolve. In 2011, decades after his missionary work, allegations surfaced. A former student claimed that Bormann had sexually abused him when the boy was 12 years old during the early 1960s at an Austrian Catholic boarding school where Bormann had worked as a priest and teacher. Additional accusations followed, describing severe physical violence against other students. By the time these allegations became public, Bormann was battling dementia. He was either unable or unwilling to address the accusations directly. The charges never resulted in legal action, but the independent Klasnick Commission, established to investigate abuses within the Catholic Church in Austria, awarded compensation to at least one accuser. Bormann received papal dispensation from his priestly vows following a serious accident and lived out his final years in relative obscurity. He died on the 11th of March 2013, a man who had tried to escape his father's shadow through devotion to its moral opposite, yet found himself accused of perpetuating cycles of abuse. The divergence in how Nazi children confronted their heritage found its starkest expression in Nicholas Frank. Born in 1939, he was the son of Hans Frank, known as the Butcher of Poland. His father had served as Hitler's personal lawyer before becoming Governor General of occupied Poland, where he presided over the murder of millions and the systematic looting of Polish cultural treasures. Nicholas was too young during the war to understand the nature of his father's work. That understanding came later, and when it did, it consumed him. Unlike Gudrun Himmler's denial or Martin Bormann's attempted escape through religious service, Nicholas Frank chose confrontation. He became a journalist and author, dedicating his career to publicly denouncing his father and examining the psychological damage inflicted by such a legacy. His books, including In the Shadow of the Reich and The Father, A Revenge, are uncommon in their unflinching hatred. He wrote with a visceral disgust that shocked German readers accustomed to more measured reflections on the Nazi past. He described his father not as a man led astray by ideology, but as a moral void, a criminal who deserved no sympathy and certainly no redemption. He refused the comfortable narratives of good men corrupted by evil times. Hans Frank was executed at Nuremberg on the 16th of October 1946, and his son has spent decades ensuring that no mythology could grow around his memory. Nicholas Frank gave lectures, participated in documentaries, and engaged in public discussions about the Holocaust, adding a perspective that was both deeply personal and historically crucial. His work serves as a counter-narrative to those who sought to rehabilitate their fathers, a reminder that some legacies cannot and should not be salvaged. Etta Goering occupied a different space in this spectrum of responses. Born on the 2nd of June 1938, she was the only child of Hermann Goering and his second wife, actress Emmy Sonnemann. As the daughter of Hitler's designated successor and the commander of the Luftwaffe, Etta was Nazi royalty. She was photographed at public events throughout her childhood, a propaganda tool meant to humanize the regime. Hitler himself was her godfather. She received extravagant gifts, including a Lucas Cranach the Elder painting, Madonna and Child, among other priceless artworks looted from Jewish collections and museums across occupied Europe. She lived at Karenhall, the vast estate north of Berlin that her father filled with stolen art, and later at a mountain residence near Berchtesgaden. The collapse of the Reich brought immediate reversal. Hermann Göring was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity at Nuremberg and sentenced to death. He cheated the hangman by swallowing a cyanide capsule on the 15th of October 1946, hours before his scheduled execution. Edda was left to navigate a world where her surname was a liability. In the 1950s and 1960s, she became embroiled in prolonged legal battles over the artwork she had received as gifts, most of which were ultimately returned to their rightful owners or to the state. She lost the majority of these cases. Unlike the children of other high-ranking Nazis who spoke publicly about their fathers, Edda Göring maintained near total silence for decades. She lived quietly, avoiding the media and public attention. Her silence broke only once, during a 1986 television interview in Sweden. She spoke lovingly of both her parents, expressing affection without apology or self-reflection. She did not condemn her father's actions. She did not acknowledge the criminality of the regime he had helped lead. She simply defended her personal experience of them as caring parents. She died on the 21st of December 2018 at the age of 80 and was buried in an unmarked grave in Munich to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. Her death passed with little public notice, the end of a life spent in willful disconnection from historical reality. Rolf Mengele's story carried a different kind of burden. He was born on the 16th of March 1944, the son of Josef Mengele, the SS doctor at Auschwitz, who conducted barbaric medical experiments on prisoners, particularly twins and children. His father's name became synonymous with the cruelest perversions of medical science in service of racial ideology. Rolf grew up in Germany knowing little of his father, who had fled to South America after the war. He was raised on the fiction that his father had been a war hero. The truth reached him gradually as a teenager, a revelation that shattered the carefully constructed lies. Josef Mengele, living under assumed names in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, corresponded sporadically with his son. These letters fueled Rolf's curiosity and, eventually, his determination to confront the man directly. In 1977, Rolf traveled to Brazil using a false passport. He met his father in a modest house near São Paulo. What he encountered was not the remorseful figure he might have hoped for, but a bitter, paranoid man who rationalized his crimes and expressed no guilt. Mengele attempted to justify the selections and experiments at Auschwitz as necessary work, as if the systematic torture and murder of innocents could be framed as scientific duty. Rolf was horrified. He despised everything his father represented, yet he could not bring himself to betray him. He kept silent about Mengele's location, a decision that allowed the angel of death to escape accountability for his crimes. Josef Mengele drowned while swimming in the ocean at Bertioga, Brazil, on the 7th of February 1979 after suffering a stroke. His death remained unknown to the wider world until 1985, when forensic examination of exhumed remains confirmed his identity. Rolf, who had known of his father's death since 1979, finally acknowledged it publicly in June 1985. He later changed his name and withdrew from public life entirely. He is believed to have worked as a corporate lawyer in Germany, living quietly with his family. He has given no interviews and made no public statements since the mid-1980s. His silence is not denial, but a refusal to be defined by a father he met only once and loathed. Wolf Rudiger Hess chose a path closer to Gudrun Himmler's defiance than to Nicholas Frank's condemnation. He was born on the 18th of November 1937, the only son of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy Führer, until his bizarre solo flight to Scotland in May 1941. Hess's mission, ostensibly an unauthorized attempt to negotiate peace with Britain, ended with his capture and lifelong imprisonment. He was convicted at Nuremberg of crimes against peace and conspiracy to commit crimes. though he was acquitted of war crimes and crimes against humanity due to his imprisonment during most of the war. He spent the remainder of his life in Spandau Prison in Berlin, eventually becoming its sole inmate after the other prisoners were released or died. Wolf was 3 years old when his father flew to Scotland. He grew up visiting him in prison, seeing him only through barriers and under supervision. Rather than distancing himself from his father's legacy, Wolf dedicated his life to his rehabilitation. In the 1950s, he established the Committee to Free Rudolf Hess, which gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures on petitions urging clemency. He argued that his father had been a man of peace, misunderstood, and unjustly punished. He wrote books defending him, contesting the narrative of Nazi criminality that surrounded the regime's leadership. When Rudolf Hess died on the 17th of August 1987, at the age of 93, the official cause was suicide by hanging. Wolf rejected this conclusion vehemently. He insisted that his father had been murdered by British intelligence, despite forensic evidence supporting suicide. He spent the rest of his life campaigning against what he called a cover-up. Wolf Rudiger Hess died in 2001, having never wavered in his loyalty to a father he believed had been a martyr rather than a criminal. Albert Speer, Jr. occupied perhaps the most ambiguous position among the children of Nazi leaders. He was born on the 29th of July, 1934, the eldest son of Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and later Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer Sr. was one of the few high-ranking Nazis to express remorse at Nuremberg, admitting moral responsibility for the regime's crimes while denying direct knowledge of the Holocaust. He was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau Prison and was released in 1966. Albert Jr. spent much of his childhood at Berchtesgaden near Hitler's Alpine retreat. There is film footage from the late 1930s showing a young Albert playing on the porch of the Berghof under Hitler's watchful gaze. After his father's conviction, the Speer family took refuge with Albert Jr.'s grandparents in Heidelberg. The young boy developed a severe stutter during this period, a psychosomatic response to the trauma and shame. He initially trained as a carpenter before shifting to architecture, the same profession as his father. He insisted throughout his life that this decision was not influenced by his father, though the parallel was inescapable. In a 2010 interview with Süddeutsche Zeitung, he addressed the question directly. "I have tried my whole life to separate myself from my father, to distance myself," he said. Yet he also stated that he could not despise his own father, revealing the complexity of his feelings. Albert Speer Jr. became a respected architect and urban planner known for environmentally conscious designs and large-scale projects, including work in China and the Middle East. He refused to condemn his father outright, maintaining a careful silence about him in public forums. He died in Frankfurt on the 15th of September 2017, at the age of 83, after a fall. He left behind a body of architectural work that stood independently of his father's legacy, though the shadow never fully lifted. These 7 lives represent a spectrum of responses to an inheritance no one would choose. Gudrun Himmler and Wolf Hess embraced denial and defiance, dedicating themselves to defending the indefensible. Martin Bormann Jr. sought escape through faith and service, only to face accusations that mirrored the cruelty he had tried to repudiate. Nicholas Frank confronted his father's crimes with unrelenting public hatred, refusing the comfort of silence. Edda Goering retreated into privacy, maintaining personal affection without public accountability. Rolf Mengele despised his father but could not bring himself to betray him, living the rest of his life under a different name. Albert Speer Jr. built a career in his father's field while insisting on separation, never fully resolving the contradiction. What unites them is the impossibility of escaping history. They were not responsible for the crimes of the Third Reich, yet they lived every day under the weight of those crimes. Some chose loyalty, some chose repudiation, some chose silence. none found peace. Their lives illustrate a fundamental truth about the aftermath of genocide. It does not end with the death of the perpetrators. It reverberates through generations, shaping identities, distorting childhoods, and creating psychological burdens that cannot be fully articulated or resolved. The children of Nazi leaders were born into a world of privilege built on mass murder. When that world collapsed, they were left to navigate the ruins, and their choices reveal as much about human psychology as they do about history's long reach. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.